that defends American industry by reimposing aluminum tariffs on Canada. Canada was taking advantage of us, as usual.
President Trump just announced that he will double the planned tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. And at this hour, Wall Street reacting to this breaking news. You're taking a live look right here at the Dow Jones Index, now down more than 460 points.
Everything began with a single decision in Washington. When Donald Trump announced heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum,
Donald Trump has announced heavy tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, raising the specter of retaliation from major trade partners like China, Canada, and Europe.
He believed it would make America stronger. But instead of weakening others, it triggered a storm that spread across global markets. Prices rose sharply, industries were shaken, and Canada saw an opportunity hidden inside the chaos. This was no longer just about trade numbers or political deals. It had turned into a struggle for power, influence, and survival in the metals industry. And now the question remains, will the United States hold its ground? Or has Canada already started to rewrite the rules of world trade? The shockwave of tariffs. The announcement came like thunder across the world's markets. When Donald Trump revealed his plan to impose steep tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, many thought it was a clever move to protect American industry. But within hours, it became clear that the impact would stretch far beyond U.S. borders. Prices shot upward, investors grew restless, and supply chains trembled under the pressure of uncertainty. What was meant to be a show of strength quickly turned into a ripple effect that no one could ignore. Canada, America's closest trading partner, was at the heart of this storm. For decades, Canadian aluminum had supplied U.S. factories, feeding industries from automobiles to aerospace. But now, with tariffs doubling costs, American manufacturers found themselves staring at shortages and rising bills. Canada, instead of panicking, took a very different approach. Leaders in Ottawa made it clear they would not be pushed into a corner. If the U.S. closed its doors, Canada would open new ones. In the cold air of Quebec, massive smelters roared to life with fresh energy. Backed by billion-dollar deals with Hydro-Quebec, Canada's aluminum industry secured clean, renewable power at low costs, making its product even more attractive to global buyers. Europe and Asia began to circle, eager for stable supply chains that Washington could no longer control. This was no longer just about tariffs. It was about who would control the future of the metals market. And with each passing day, the balance seemed to be shifting north. While America celebrated its hardline stance, Canada quietly prepared a strategy that would change everything. Ottawa knew that tariffs could not be fought with words alone. They needed action, and they needed it fast. Within weeks, emergency meetings were held with industry leaders, and a bold plan was put in motion. Billions were directed towards stabilizing smelters, protecting jobs, and keeping production steady, no matter how high American tariffs climbed.
The vibe is still off between Canada and America when it comes to trade negotiations, Donna, with U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra saying a considerable amount of work needs to be done to try and reach a deal, and that the biggest U.S. complaint is the fact Canada retaliated at all.
Canada's message to the world was simple. If the U.S. wanted to play tough, Canada was ready. But rather than fight with anger, Ottawa turned to strategy. They accelerated billion-dollar expansions in Quebec's aluminum plants, locking in long-term clean energy contracts that gave Canadian metal a unique edge. Not only was it cheaper, it was greener, a powerful selling point for buyers in Europe and Asia who were eager to cut emissions and secure cleaner supply chains. Across the Atlantic, European negotiators moved quickly, updating trade deals that prioritized Canadian shipments before U.S. prices climbed further. In Asia, smelters and manufacturers shifted purchase orders north, cutting their reliance on American imports. Suddenly, Canada was no longer on the defensive, it was leading the game. For U.S. factories, the choices narrowed: pay steep premiums at home or watch competitors overseas secure Canadian aluminum at far better rates. Either way, America's industries were bleeding. What began as a tariff meant to strengthen Washington was quietly fueling Canada's rise as a global metals powerhouse. The markets did not wait for politicians to catch their breath. The moment tariffs were announced, aluminum prices spiked overnight. Traders from New York to London watched screens flash red as costs surged to levels not seen in years. The Midwest Premium, a key measure of U.S. aluminum pricing, skyrocketed by more than 50%.
U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum doubled to 50%. Now, while some are praising the action, others are worried,
shaking the confidence of manufacturers who relied on stable supply. What was meant to secure American factories had instead pushed them to the edge of panic. Inside corporate boardrooms, executives scrambled. Automakers worried about ballooning costs for car frames and engine parts. Aerospace companies faced the possibility of delayed production as aluminum became harder to secure. Even beverage companies, which needed the metal for millions of cans, braced for higher prices that could spill directly onto store shelves. The shock spread fast, touching industries big and small. Meanwhile, Canada's producers sensed opportunity. With long-term power deals already signed, their costs stayed predictable while U.S. competitors watched expenses spiral. Canadian smelters not only kept operating, they expanded, pushing forward massive projects in Quebec designed to double output over the coming years. Global buyers took notice. In Brussels, negotiators whispered about fresh agreements that would guarantee Canadian shipments. In Shanghai, buyers began quietly redirecting orders north. And as each deal was signed, the message grew louder. Canada was no longer just a supplier, it was becoming the world's most reliable source of aluminum. For Washington, the storm it had unleashed was spinning out of control. As markets shook under the weight of Trump's tariffs, Canada's leaders wasted no time showing they would not be bullied. In Ottawa, emergency meetings stretched late into the night. Ministers, economists, and industry heads gathered around tables, determined to send a clear signal to Washington. Canada would stand its ground. The response was swift. Ottawa announced billions in financial support for smelters, ensuring production lines would keep running even if tariffs cut into profits. Smaller producers, the most vulnerable in this fight, were promised lifelines to protect jobs in towns where aluminum was more than business, it was survival. At the same time, Canada reclassified aluminum as a strategic resource, a move that instantly raised its importance in both domestic planning and international negotiations. But Canada didn't stop there. Instead of focusing only on defense, Ottawa went on the offensive. New export routes were drawn up to Europe and Asia, breaking the old habit of relying almost entirely on the U.S. The message was clear. If America wanted to close one door, Canada would simply open 10 more. The effect was immediate. International buyers, hungry for reliable supply, lined up for Canadian deals. While American manufacturers faced shrinking options, Canada positioned itself as the stable partner in a turbulent market. Washington had tried to corner its neighbor with tariffs, but instead, Ottawa had turned the moment into leverage, strengthening its global ties and proving that resilience could be a powerful weapon in any trade war. The impact of Canada's countermeasures didn't stay local, it rippled across the globe. From the ports of Quebec to production floors in Shanghai, the shift was already underway. Asian manufacturers, who had long relied on American aluminum, quietly redirected their orders north. Europe followed, eager to secure stable, low-carbon supplies before U.S. costs spiraled even higher. In financial markets, speculation grew. Analysts predicted that Canadian aluminum, produced on clean hydroelectric power, could undercut U.S. prices by as much as 20%. Investors watched closely as Quebec smelters expanded capacity, fully aware that these moves could reshape global trade balances. Meanwhile, U.S. factories faced an unthinkable choice: pay the inflated tariffs or navigate complex international channels to secure the same materials. Every delayed decision meant production lines slowed, costs rose, and profits shrank. Back in Canada, the mood was markedly different. For the first time, the aluminum industry was not just surviving, it was thriving. Long-term energy agreements with Hydro-Quebec ensured predictable costs, while strategic investments allowed plants to operate more efficiently than ever before. Beyond dollars and cents, Canada was gaining influence. By demonstrating that it could reroute supply chains, the nation was proving to the world and to Washington that it could act independently on its own terms. The stakes were clear. This wasn't just a trade dispute anymore. It was a test of who would control the future of metals, supply chains, and manufacturing worldwide. And as each day passed, Canada's position grew stronger, quietly challenging the United States' long-standing dominance. By midsummer, the trade war had evolved far beyond tariffs and numbers. It had become a battle of strategy and influence. Washington had expected immediate pressure on Canada, but instead, Ottawa was turning the tables. Each new policy, each new expansion, strengthened Canada's position while forcing U.S. manufacturers to absorb rising costs or navigate increasingly complicated supply chains. In Quebec, aluminum plants were operating at full throttle. Long-term agreements with Hydro-Quebec locked in affordable, clean energy, giving Canadian smelters a unique advantage. These deals were more than financial, they were a statement. Canada could produce faster, cheaper, and greener than the competition. As production increased, shipments flowed smoothly to Europe and Asia, bypassing the United States entirely. The ripple effects were profound. American factories struggled to secure materials, while international buyers leaned heavily on Canadian suppliers. Analysts began to speak of a permanent shift in trade patterns, with Canada now seen as a dependable alternative in a fractured global market. Meanwhile, Ottawa continued to expand its influence, using these moves to strengthen negotiations on electric vehicle incentives, green energy policies, and strategic partnerships abroad. For the United States, the initial confidence of imposing tariffs began to waver. What had started as a plan to protect domestic industries now threatened to undermine them. Canada's careful mix of strategy, investment, and diplomacy was proving that resilience, not retaliation, could redefine the balance of power in global trade. The question looming over both nations was clear. Could the U.S. recover control, or had Canada already gained the upper hand in a game that was only beginning? As summer turned toward fall, the world began to notice the subtle but powerful shift in trade dynamics. Canada's actions were no longer seen as mere retaliation. They were a signal that the balance of power in metals and manufacturing was evolving. International buyers, once dependent on U.S. supply, now looked north for stability, clean energy, and predictable pricing. European companies moved quickly to secure Canadian aluminum at pre-tariff rates, fearing higher costs from American suppliers. Asian manufacturers followed suit, realigning their supply chains in a way that bypassed the United States entirely. The result was a quiet but decisive realignment of global trade, with Canada emerging as a reliable partner in an increasingly fractured market. Within Ottawa, leaders recognized the strategic potential. The government wasn't just protecting its own industries, it was building leverage. By demonstrating its ability to redirect supply chains and maintain stable production, Canada gained influence in international negotiations, from electric vehicle incentives to green energy deals. Meanwhile, U.S. manufacturers struggled to adapt. Costs continued to rise, production timelines slipped, and the pressure on executives mounted. What had started as a straightforward tariff policy had morphed into a complex geopolitical challenge. The stakes were no longer confined to steel and aluminum. Every decision had broader implications for global trade, energy policy, and industrial competitiveness. Canada's calculated resilience was rewriting the rules, and the world was watching closely. In this evolving landscape, one thing was certain: The next moves by both nations would determine not just profits, but the very future of the metals market. Canada's response to the tariffs went beyond diplomacy. It was a full-scale industrial strategy. In Quebec, massive aluminum smelters were expanding, backed by billions in investment and long-term energy contracts. These facilities weren't just bigger, they were smarter, running on clean hydroelectric power that guaranteed low costs and a minimal carbon footprint. Every ton of aluminum produced became a statement. Canada was ready to compete on quality, price, and reliability. Across the country, the ripple effects were undeniable. Ports were upgraded, rail lines optimized, and logistics streamlined to ensure that shipments reached Europe and Asia without crossing U.S. soil. Cold storage facilities, intermodal yards, and deepwater docks allowed Canadian exports to move faster and more efficiently than ever before. The infrastructure wasn't just practical, it was strategic. Global buyers took notice. European manufacturers, eager to secure low-carbon aluminum, booked shipments months in advance. Asian industries shifted orders north, reducing reliance on U.S. suppliers. Canada wasn't just defending its market, it was reshaping it. For Washington, the picture was becoming clear. Tariffs had failed to pressure Canada into submission. Instead, they had spurred a surge in industrial growth, trade diversification, and global influence. Canadian leaders had turned potential setbacks into a fortress of opportunity, demonstrating that resilience, foresight, and strategic investment could rewrite the rules of engagement in the global metals market. In a single summer, what began as a defensive move had evolved into a powerful offensive. Canada was no longer reacting, it was leading, and the world was starting to take notice. America under pressure. While Canada quietly built its advantage, the United States felt the impact of its own tariffs acutely. Steel and aluminum prices continued to climb, straining factories and supply chains across the country. Automakers and aerospace manufacturers faced tough choices: absorb rising costs, slow production, or scramble to source materials from alternative markets. Each decision carried consequences that rippled through entire industries. Meanwhile, international buyers grew increasingly aware of Canada's reliability. European and Asian companies, wary of U.S. unpredictability, shifted their orders to Canadian suppliers. Clean, low-cost aluminum, combined with a streamlined export system, made Canada the preferred partner. The more America tried to enforce its tariffs, the more momentum Canada gained in global markets. Inside boardrooms in Washington, executives worried not just about immediate losses, but long-term competitiveness. Delays in production threatened to reduce market share, and rising costs made U.S. goods less attractive internationally. Meanwhile, Canada's industrial growth created jobs, attracted investment, and strengthened its negotiating position for trade and green energy incentives. By now, the stakes were unmistakable. The U.S. had aimed to secure domestic industries, but the tariffs had inadvertently strengthened a competitor. Canada's resilience, foresight, and strategic planning had shifted the balance of power. What began as a defensive move had become a global statement. Adaptability and long-term vision could triumph where aggression alone could not. The question lingered over both nations. Could the United States regain control, or was it watching a permanent shift unfold before its eyes? Canada's secret weapon wasn't just strategy, it was energy. By securing long-term hydroelectric contracts, the nation ensured that its aluminum smelters ran on clean, affordable power. This gave Canadian metal a unique edge: lower costs, lower carbon emissions, and greater appeal to global buyers increasingly focused on sustainability. While U.S. manufacturers struggled under soaring tariffs, Canada quietly solidified its reputation as a reliable, eco-friendly supplier. European companies rushed to lock in shipments, eager to meet both supply needs and environmental goals. Asian industries followed, recognizing that Canada offered stability, predictability, and a green premium that the U.S. simply could not match under the tariff regime. Infrastructure upgrades amplified the advantage. Ports, railways, and intermodal hubs ensured Canadian aluminum could move efficiently to overseas markets. Every shipment reinforced Canada's growing influence, sending a clear message. The country wasn't just surviving, it was thriving in a world that valued both cost and sustainability. The ripple effect reached beyond metals. Energy consumption, logistics planning, and even green technology investments began to align with Canada's rising industrial power. Strategic diversification, clean energy, and careful planning had transformed a defensive response into a long-term advantage, one that could influence global trade for years. What had begun as a reactive measure to U.S. tariffs had grown into a carefully crafted strategy of dominance. Canada's industrial and environmental foresight was reshaping supply chains, redefining markets, and quietly asserting its role as a global powerhouse. By late summer, it was clear that the trade war had reached a tipping point. Canada's actions had shifted global dynamics, forcing industries and governments to rethink long-standing dependence. What had started as a defensive response to tariffs had blossomed into a full-scale repositioning of power in the metals market. U.S. manufacturers continued to struggle under inflated costs. Automakers, aerospace companies, and other industries that relied on steel and aluminum faced delays, higher prices, and shrinking margins. Every missed delivery, every production slowdown, served as a stark reminder that tariffs alone could not secure dominance. Meanwhile, international buyers increasingly preferred Canadian aluminum, drawn by its reliability, affordability, and clean energy credentials. In Ottawa, the government watched as strategic investments, clean energy deals, and upgraded logistics began to pay off. Long-term contracts guaranteed supply to Europe and Asia, strengthening Canada's position as a trusted global partner. The country's ability to adapt, innovate, and diversify trade routes had turned potential vulnerability into a competitive advantage. The global spotlight was on Canada's ports, smelters, and energy infrastructure. From Montreal to Shanghai, buyers and investors were recalibrating their strategies. The United States, once the dominant force, now faced the daunting challenge of catching up or conceding ground. As the tension peaked, one question dominated the minds of leaders and industry experts alike. Could America reverse the momentum? Or had Canada permanently claimed the upper hand in a market it once served? New era of trade. As the dust settled on the tariffs and countermeasures, one truth became undeniable. Canada had transformed a challenge into an opportunity. Strategic investments in smelters, long-term clean energy agreements, and upgraded logistics had not only protected jobs and industries at home, they had positioned the nation as a global leader in metals supply. U.S. manufacturers, meanwhile, were still grappling with the consequences. Costs remained high, production delays persisted, and international buyers increasingly relied on Canadian sources. What began as a move to strengthen domestic industry had inadvertently fueled a competitor's rise. Globally, the message was clear. Canada was now a trusted partner, offering reliability, efficiency, and sustainability. Europe and Asia had embraced this new supply chain, and strategic diversification ensured that the country would remain resilient even in future trade conflicts. This story is more than numbers or tariffs. It's a lesson in strategy, foresight, and resilience. It shows how careful planning, clean energy, and decisive action can turn adversity into a lasting advantage. The world is watching, and Canada has proven that bold, smart moves can redefine global markets. And now, the question remains, how will the United States respond, and what will the next chapter of global trade look like? If you found this story fascinating and want to follow the latest developments in global trade and industry, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The next wave of market shifts could be just around the corner.